This week on Obsessed with Wine.
It was an exciting weekend, and I went there, and I remember when I smelled the wine for the first time, and when I took a first sip, I just couldn't believe it because it was, you know how they say love at first sight. It was love at first sip. I was absolutely amazed by the wine.
Hello, fellow wine enthusiasts. My name is Wesley Cable, and I want to welcome you to episode number 6 of Obsessed with Wine. Chandon is well known in Napa Valley for their terrific hospitality and beautiful sparkling wines. Chandon, formerly known as Domaine Chandon, is owned by multinational corporation Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, headquartered in Paris, France. Chandon makes sparkling wine from the same grape varieties that are used to make champagne in Champagne: Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. They also create the sparkling wine using the traditional method, which means the wine is put through a secondary fermentation in the bottle, which creates the bubbles that we all love. Tonight, I welcome the talented Margarita Postoronca. Margarita is a viticulturist and grower relations representative for Chandon. In this interview, Margarita shares her inspirational wine journey that brought her all the way to California from her home country of Moldova. We also talk about what it's like working for some of the most famous wineries in Napa, including Corrison Winery and the Ridge Vineyards. Finally, you'll hear her talk about the differences in viticulture practices between sparkling wine and still wine. Grab a glass of your favorite wine. It's time for Obsessed with Wine. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining me tonight. I'm really excited about this very special guest. Her name is Margarita Postoronca. She's a viticulturist and grower relations at Chandon in Napa. And she's the very first viticulturist I've had on the show. So I'm really excited to learn a lot about what she does and what she does for the wineries. She's worked at a lot of pretty famous wineries, so I expect to get some interesting stories, too, from her about her experiences at those places, as well as talking about some sparkling wine tonight. She's also the first person I've talked to recently on this show that talks about sparkling wine, so we'll be talking about that as well. So, Margarita, welcome. I appreciate you joining me tonight.
Thank you very much, Wesley, for having me here.
You're welcome. Now, I wanted to start with just a little story. Most people don't know that the first interview that I ever had for a permanent job at a winery was at Chandon. This was after my first harvest that I did, and I felt like I was ready for a permanent full-time job. And so I had an interview at Chandon. And I just remember going into the main building there in Napa, and there was this huge room with a lot of offices around, and there was people there with their doors open in these little offices, and every one of them was speaking French. So to me, that was amazing. Like, I'd never heard anything like that before. So I was pretty impressed by that. And then I realized, just doing a little bit more research into Chandon, that they're owned by Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy still, and that makes sense. That's why we heard a lot of French there. So was your experience like that when you went there, Margarita? I'm sure your interview went better than mine, but did you have the same experience there?
Yes, I would say to some extent that is true, that our parent company is based in France. So we do have a lot of people working for the company who came from France, but not only France. Since we're such a big international company, or our parent company is, we have people from all over the world. So I would say French and Spanish are the two languages that I hear the most. Spanish from Argentina, because we have a winery in Argentina as well, and a lot of people came from that area. But you could hear, I don't want to say almost every single language, but I can give you a story about my first interview. Well, it's not actually interview, it's what happened after. We were sitting in the room where we did a safety training, kind of an introduction for the company after I've been hired and a few other employees. So in the same room, there was a person from Australia, United States, Mexico, Taiwan, and myself from Moldova. So that's going to give you a pretty good idea about our company and how international it is. So you do get to hear many different languages in our around our admin building.
So you mentioned French and Spanish. Do you speak French or Spanish?
Spanish more than French. French, I did learn it in high school. I never really got a chance to practice it. And to be completely honest, it was probably not the best language learning class I have ever taken because it was based on memorization. So at least that was the teaching style of my professor at the time. But Spanish, since I work in the wine industry, well, it's a very important language to speak. I'm still learning. I'm still at the learning stages. I do understand it quite well and I speak a little bit, but I am taking classes, in fact, right now. So I'm trying to get better.
Well, good for you. By the way, just to end my story, I didn't end up getting a job. It was for a job that was working in the cellar, and it was working also helping out in the lab before the cellar work got started, and it was going to start at like 4 o'clock in the morning. And I was living 2 hours away at the time, and so I was kind of glad they didn't call me. But that's kind of how my story went, my interview story. So. All right, so let's talk a little bit about you then, Margarita. So you grew up over in Moldova, and for people who don't know, that's between Ukraine and Romania. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
And what is the wine growing and production like in Moldova for someone like me who doesn't know?
Well, first, it's a very small country. The total population is about 4 million people. So I think I'll start with that just to give you an idea. It's a very small country. It has Ukraine on the east side and Romania on the western side. Wine has been present in that region for over 3,000 years. So we started back in the days. It's something that runs in our blood system. So it's a quite big industry. During Soviet Union, Moldova was one of the biggest suppliers of the wine for the Union itself. So during Soviet Union, that's when the industry really became big and it was more production oriented, obviously, because they had to supply wine to so many different countries. And after the Union fell apart, there was no need for such a big quantities anymore. So people started focusing on smaller businesses, business models. And I would say in the last 10 years, it's pretty incredible what has been done there. There's a lot of small boutique wineries really focusing on high quality. Most of the wine still gets exported, and the main markets are European Union and Asia, mostly China. But those are the two biggest markets, but and internal market, of course. The question that I often get asked is what kind of wine do we make? All sorts
Yeah, I
of
was going to
wines.
ask what do you grow? What grows well over there, and what do you guys make?
So we make most of the classic varieties for whatever it means. So anything you can think of, such as Cabernet, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Merlot. Those are doing very well. There is some Malbec. There is some Pinot Noir. It's a little warmer for Pinot Noir, so it's not very popular. Some of the Georgian varieties, and some, of course, some of the local old traditional varieties of Moldova that are very unique, and they're coming from Fitasca family. It's the Fitasca, it's the name of the variety. So there is Fitasca Neagră, which is a red variety, and Fitasca Alba, which is a white variety. They are very different, despite they share a similar name. The red variety is very tannic and very dark in color, very concentrated, and the white one is more floral and aromatic, very light wine. And what it is very common and what has been common in the last 10 years is blending those local varieties with the classic varieties. So you can find all sorts of blends like a Sauvignon Blanc Fitasca Alba or things like that. It's just an example. So people really play a lot with blends, and that's one of the ways to put our country out there on the market because if someone sees an unknown variety, not everyone is going to reach for that bottle on the shelf. But when they see it blended with something that they're familiar with, the hope is that people will reach and try and explore the wines.
So since you've been here and you've seen how wine is made here and how it's made in Moldova, are there big differences between just the winemaking styles between the two countries?
It is. I think just like with the rest of the Europe, the overall style is a little different. Wines in Moldova tend to be a part of the meal. So generally lower in alcohol. That's the big difference, and more approachable with food, with high acidity. So something that helps you digest and enjoy your dinner along with a glass of wine, to enjoy your evening after that without feeling too buzzed. In terms of technicality, it is quite different because Moldova is a part of OIV, but this is the organization that most of the European countries follow the rules of in terms of the technical aspects of the winemaking. So there are quite a few rules that people need to follow in order to make wine. It's not as strict as, let's say, in different regions of France, for example, but it's quite strict on a lot of things, on different additions and other technical aspects.
So you would know better than I would, of course, but out here, like say in California, people say that there's a lot of freedom that the winemakers get to kind of do things that they want to do. Is that something you've seen versus what you're used to that happened in Moldova when you were home?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. I really like that part about California. In fact, I again confirmed that on my recent trip to France, which happened in December, and just being out there walking the vineyards, some vineyards in the winter, you can still see a little bit. Unfortunately, that was the first time when I was able to take a long vacation. So, but talking to people and just reminding myself and realizing, like, wow, how lucky we are here in California, because we get to do a lot more things more freely, and we experiment with a lot of things. And by any means, I'm not saying that what they do in other countries is bad. It's not. It's just very different. So I feel like once you experience this kind of freedom, it's hard to go back to the old world way of doing things.
So you went to college over there in Moldova. You went to Technical University of Moldova, and I guess since you said that wine is big there, that makes sense why they would have a viticulture and enology program. So how did you actually get into wine, and why did you decide that was the study for you when you went to college?
Well, I sort of grew up around wine. My grandparents had a house outside of the city, and I grew up in the capital of Moldova. I grew up in the city, but they had a house about 15 minutes away. So I used to spend all of my summers and vacations there. And it's quite common that in Moldova, people make homemade wine. So my grandfather used to make a barrel of wine every single year, and that's what he drank throughout the winter time. And by the time spring came and whatever was left in the barrel would get oxidized, he would distill it and make a grappa type beverage. So
Wow.
that's something very cultural and like very characteristic of the countrysides in Moldova. So I grew up. First, he had a few vines around the house. So I grew up just eating those grapes without knowing that they were actually for wine production rather than table grapes. But, as I was 5, 6 years old, I didn't really care. And of course, I helped him a little bit, or whenever I was there, pressing off the wine because he had a little hand press. So, of course, it was fun for me being a child and being involved in all of that. I really didn't know much about wine at the time. Again, I was 5, 6 years old. So, what could I know? I knew that I did not like wine when I first tried it. I can't tell you how old I was. I was quite young, but it tasted acidic and not very good. So, I was like, how can you drink that? Like, and that kind of that paused my journey with wine for quite a few years. And then as I was 15, 16 years old, trying to figure out what it is I want to do in life, I knew a few things. I knew that I did not know what I wanted to do, let's put it that way. But I knew that I really wanted to be able to travel, and I really wanted to have a somewhat technical job. Like chemistry, I really like chemistry, for example, in high school was one of my favorite subjects. So I liked math, so I knew it has to be technical. And my mother and I sat down one time and we were kind of brainstorming. And she's like, well, have you ever considered winemaking? And I was like, what? Like, is that the real thing? And she's like, oh, yes, like it is. Like, there is a university and it's quite good program. And, you would be able to travel. They make wine in so many different countries. And that's when it struck to me. I was like, wow, I guess that could really be something interesting. So I started doing more research, reading about it, trying to get as much information as I could. And I decided to apply. Why not? And in fact, it was the only university I applied to. I was quite determined by the end of my research journey and everything. I was like, no, this is where I need to get in. So I got in and I've never regretted it ever since.
So is that a 4-year school that you went to get that degree?
Yes, it was a 4-year school.
And when you're done with that school and you graduate and you have your degree, then at that time were you thinking, I'm going to go to California, I'm going to make wine, or did you know what you were going to be doing after that?
So I actually knew that even before I graduated. So I did get a chance to come to the US after my second year of university, and that was a cultural exchange program. So nothing related to wine, more of a language exchange program, like 3 months long. And I actually went to Florida. And I do get a lot of jokes about that these days. Of course, now I live in California, but it was beautiful. I was living in a town on the Gulf of Mexico coast. It was absolutely stunning. I did traveled after that to New York and Washington, D.C. Absolutely fell in love with the United States and was like, no, I have to come back. I want to experience the wine industry in the US because, again, in Florida, there wasn't much.
Right.
So I did apply for an internship, and here in California. So after my third year, I took an internship at the winery in Monterey County. It's called Ridge Vineyards. They are quite large, and people know about them. So I ended up coming here for an internship, and I originally came for 6 months, and then they extended my contract for another 6 months. So I spent the full year in California. Went back to Moldova, graduated, and I knew by the time by the time I returned, I was like, no, I have to be able to come back. I really enjoyed the industry here. I was not exposed to Napa Valley because I was in Monterey County, opposed to that wine region. I did come to Napa a few times and visited a few wineries, but I knew little about Napa back then.
So I have a question about that. So when you're back in Moldova and you're going to college and you're learning about wine, do they talk about Napa Valley at all? Is it something that's even brought up in the curriculum, or is it just a whole world away and people don't talk about it?
It's a whole world away and people don't talk about it.
Okay.
Because the education system is very good. It has a very, very strong basis when it comes to science, engineering, all of these aspects, but not a whole lot of professors or university staff speaks English. Just because they're older generation, they lived most of their life in the Soviet Union. That's not what people learned back then. And as you know, most of the information and research these days, it's all in English. So people have limited access to information. And that's the only reason why they don't teach it. But it's changed. I had a few younger professors who did speak the language and tried to bring up some of the technologies from abroad, but we never spoke about Napa Valley or most of the wine regions.
So after you finished and you ended up coming back to California and going to UC Davis to get your master's degree in viticulture and enology. So how did you hear about UC Davis and why did you choose UC Davis?
Well, the first time I've heard about it back in Moldova. That's one thing I did hear about because it was always brought up as one of the best universities for wine, viticulture, and enology research. The dean of the faculty at the time, he visited UC Davis at some point. So he even visited it. And so he always spoke about it very highly. So I did hear about that, like I said, back in Moldova, and then, of course, after I spent a year in California, a few of my of the people on the Shy team were UC Davis graduates. So I did hear about it. I've always heard about it. I to be honest, until I got in, I never thought it would be possible. I remember the day I got my acceptance letter, it was like, wow, this is something if someone told me this even 2 years ago, would have never believed that. So I was very, very excited to get in and to start my program there.
Yeah, that's a great story. I really like that. That's awesome. Good for you. So, all right. So now you're at Davis, and you went for a master's degree. So I know a lot of people who went to Davis. They got a bachelor's degree and they have a successful career working in winemaking, doing whatever they're doing. So why a master's degree? Why was that important to you? Why did you want to do that?
Well, because I already felt like I had quite a bit of knowledge from my previous degree. Again, my university was quite strong, especially in chemistry and sciences. And second, from just work experience, I've done my internship at Shide, and then I also spent almost a year working as an assistant winemaker in Moldova until I got accepted to UC Davis. So I have already had some practical experience and technical experience. So I definitely thought that that I was a better fit for a program, and the program was a better fit for me. I also really like the fact that it's a combined program. I know that people have mixed feelings about that because you kind of learn a little bit of both, but it actually changed my life and my professional life, and we'll get to it later. But the fact that I was exposed a lot to the viticultural aspects and viticultural subjects, again, really changed my future career.
So is that where you kind of fell in love with viticulture? Is at UC Davis, or did you have this passion before that?
It's interesting because I often think about it. I did mention that I grew up in the city, but I did spend every single summer with my grandparents, helping them around the house. They had a flower garden. That's what they did. So they sold flowers commercially for a little bit. And then they had other fruits and vegetables. So I've always been exposed to that part of the world, the agricultural part of the world, but that was not something that I considered in my career. And here it's interesting because it's very cultural. And when I was going to university, it was always expected that people who go to the university I went to will end up being winemakers or work in a lab or things like that, because agriculture is still, despite it has such a long history in Moldova, it doesn't have a very strong academic program. It's decent, but it's not as strong as you would imagine. The agricultural knowledge is something that gets passed from generation to generation quite often, and not something you could learn very well in school. So I was not exposed to the viticulture as much as you would think in Moldova, just because it's again, there are many reasons why, but when I came to California and I realized, like, wow, there's just so much research and knowledge, and so many things are actually happening in the grapevines I never thought about, physiological processes, responses to different things. It was like, oh my God, this is fascinating. And like I said, I like technical things and I like science. So I was like, this is incredible. So that was kind of the first or the big one for me that got me into viticulture.
So did you actually make a conscious decision at some point to say, all right, I'm not interested, or I'm not as interested in winemaking. I really want to, focus more on the vineyard and viticulture?
Yeah, so UC Davis has a 2-year program, and after my second year, after I was about to graduate, I was looking for internships. I was still thinking that I want to be on the wine side of things, just because I haven't really experienced the viticulture, the vineyard, or any job on the vineyard side of things. I thought, oh, I actually should get the vineyard internship so I can be a better winemaker, so I can know more about what's happening in the field when I'm going to be making my decisions in future. And that internship was a turning point, definitely. I worked for Ridge Vineyards. I was based at Lytton Springs facility up in Hillsburg. If you know a little bit about wine, you know you know a little bit about Ridge, or at least you've heard the name.
I do, and I got a lot of questions about Ridge, so hopefully you can answer them for me a little later.
Yes, definitely. I'm happy to. But it's a magical vineyard, the one that I was working with a lot of old Zinfandel vines, and not only, but it's just a very special place. Would always hold it will always hold a very special place in my heart. And after almost 3 weeks of night harvest, I was still excited. And that's when my manager at the time told me, yeah, you're definitely a vineyard kind of person. If after 3 weeks of switching day and night and you're still as excited as you were from the very beginning, you know that's you're in the right place.
So let's go back just a little bit then. So you had a lab internship. You worked in the lab at Scheid Vineyards. That was your first internship. Then you went back to Moldova, where you said you had an assistant winemaker position, and then you came back and you had a cellar internship at another pretty famous winery in Napa, at Corrison Winery, right?
Yes. So I did an internship at Courson while I was at UC Davis, so between my 2 years.
So what was that experience like? I know Kathy Corrison's a very popular winemaker. She's almost, I guess you could say she's kind of a legend in wine. So what was it like working there?
I went there because I fell in love with her wines. So we went, as I was in Davis, one of my peers organized a wine tasting for the weekend. And that was the place where we went. It was a group of 5 or 6 of us. So we went to Courson. I knew nothing about Courson. I did not know Kathy's story. I was just excited to go to some wine tasting in Napa because the first year at Davis was quite tough. And it was like I had no time to do anything else other than study. So it was an exciting weekend. And I went there and I remember when I smelled the wine for the first time and when I took a first sip, I just couldn't believe it because it was how they say love at first sight. It was love at first sip. I was absolutely amazed by the wine. There are many things that's special about it. She makes very elegant wines that are quite different from a lot of the other things that are made around here in Napa. And then I learned the story, so of course I was, again, I got pretty excited. So I got in touch with some of my professors at Davis, and I said, I want to go learn from her. Like, I need to get in touch with Kathy because we went tasting over a long weekend. So she was not available. So we didn't get a chance to meet her. And one of my professors, one of my mentors from UC Davis, actually got me her email, and I got in touch with her, and I said, like, I can do it. I really want to work here. I really want to learn from you because this is the most amazing wine I have tried, period, ever. And yeah, and that's how I got well, we interviewed, of course, and that's how I got to work harvest for Kathy.
Well, that's pretty amazing. Yeah, that's a really good story. So once you get hired and you're working there, is she there day to day working, getting her hands dirty like everyone else? Is that how it is?
Oh yeah, definitely. She's the one. She was present at all the grape picks. So she would start super early with the guys in the field. So she would always be there once the fruit arrived to the winery, and her husband was the one unloading and the grapes and putting them into press, so driving the forklift around. So it was a very family-like environment. There was another friend of their family who was working alongside with all of us, and it was just great because it felt like you're just a part of the small family, and you were, and you are. I keep in touch with everyone I worked there with, most of the people who are still there, so I do keep in touch with them. I keep in touch with Kathy. I try to stop by as much as I can when I have a chance. So yeah, but it was a very wonderful experience because yes, she did get her hands dirty. She was present every day, and she lives really close to the winery, so she sometimes used to bike to work and back. So, but she was always there.
So you recommended tonight, I asked you, and I usually ask the guests, give me a couple of wines that you're interested in or that you're passionate about. And one of the wines you brought up was this Corrison Cabernet Sauvignon 2018. So tell me about this wine. What's so special about this wine, and why did you pick this?
Well, that's actually the vintage I worked there, so it is very special.
I see. So we're
So
drinking some of your work here, I guess.
yes, just a tiny bit, but of course, just the harvest part of it. Yes, I was very excited when she released the wine, and it was, I believe, in 2021, after 3 years that the wine was released. And yes, of course, I also have a few bottles. So Kathy makes a few wines, and this one is one of the first wines that she started making. The fruit comes from 3 different vineyards, all really close to the winery, 2 of which Kathy actually owns.
Hmm.
And the blend varies from year to year, just depending. The percentage of each vineyard varies, but the core is the same. It's a blend of the Santillina Cabernets. I really like that wine because, well, she makes one of her other flagship, or the flagship wine that she makes, if you can call it that way, is the Cronus one. And Cronus comes from the vineyard behind the winery. Those vines, I believe this year they must be turning 50 or 51 years old. So it's old vine Cabernet, really beautiful and special vineyard. But Cronus really needs time to age. It's one of my favorite wines in general, but like I said, it does need time to age. So it's not the wine that I would recommend opening tonight versus the Napa Valley Cabernet, because it's so approachable. It can age beautifully for many years. And as I worked there, I got to try some of the older vintages, and I can tell you for sure it does age very, very well. But it's also quite approachable when at such young age, and that's what I like about it. It does need some air, but it's a beautiful wine uh, to open even in the first few years of its life.
So moving on then from Corrison, were you at Ridge Vineyards then? That's when you finally got
Hmm.
over to Ridge Vineyards. And this was as a viticulture intern. So this was really where you wanted to be, right? In the vineyards and working with the plants and all that stuff, right? So what was it like
Yes,
working at Ridge?
different, very different. Just because of the vineyard, I mostly old vines, so very different approach to farming. And Ridge farms organically, which was my first exposure to organic farming, and they mostly even dry farm in that area, so quite different.
Let me ask you a question real quick, just for people who don't know. Farming organically, and I know that's popular, and a lot of people talk about how they farm organically. What does that actually mean for people who don't know?
It can mean a few different things. You can simply farm organically and not being certified, meaning you're trying to do what's right for the plant and nature and not use very harmful chemicals. And that's what actually Kathy does. So Kathy Corrison does farm organically in an organic way, but she's not certified. And there are wineries or bigger wineries and that do get certified, and there are certification programs. So it usually takes 3 years to get certified organic, meaning you follow the rules of the certification. So there is a list of products that you're allowed to use and at the same time not allowed to use. So it's about using the products that are less harmful for the environment, just in this, trying to put it in quite simple terms. So it does mean something that people are using chemicals that are, again, more environmentally friendly, bee friendly, and trying not to use any of the very strong chemicals that can harm the environment and that have sort of, I would say, like a broader action that can harm insects and other things. So trying to avoid those.
So, did you know about Ridge Vineyards before you worked there? Did you know about the reputation and just how amazing the wines are and all that? Did you have an idea what that was all about before you started?
I tried the wine, and that's why it's a funny story because it's interesting that they get to share it tonight, because it's really tells you about life and how sometimes the fact that things don't go as you plan are for the best. And if I can share that, I would love to, because it's really, I don't want to say a destiny kind of story, but one of those. So after I finished harvest at Kathy's winery, we had We had a tasting group at UC Davis for students of the department, where every week there was a themed wine tasting, and you could lead it as a student or as a professor, or we had guests who came and presented wines. It was in a smaller group, I think up to 20 people, where we tasted wines. So once we invited the Old Vine Society, if I remember correctly. So there were a few people from the wineries that tried to preserve older vineyards with old historic vines. So Historic Vineyard Society. And David Gates, who is the VP of vineyards for Ridge Vineyard, was there. So he brought a bottle of Ridge, and I tasted it. I was like, it was the second time, one of those wow moments. It's like, what is this wine? I want to learn more about it. And I did not get to chance to talk to Dave after the tasting because there were so many people, and it was just very, at the end of it was just a lot going on. So I was like, wow, this is a nice winery. I want to learn more about them. And I kind of left it there because at the time, again, I was looking for a winemaking internship. So, or right after that, I was looking for a winemaking internship. So I just remembered that I loved the wine. And later that year, that happened in fall of 2018 is when I tasted the wine. And then I was going to apply for an internship in New Zealand. I thought, during my UC Davis program, I scheduled my research work in a way that I could have a winter quarter off. And I thought I should go and work somewhere in the Southern Hemisphere. And I chose to go to New Zealand. But unfortunately, because I'm the citizen of Moldova, fortunately for me, but unfortunately for the visa requirements for me were quite strict. So they ended up not giving me a visa to go to New Zealand. And this kind of fell through. So I did get an internship in Hawke's Bay, but I ended up not being able to go because they didn't approve my visa. So I was very sad. And I didn't know what to do because I already, like I said, I scheduled my research work in the way that I was free during that quarter. So I reached out to Kathy at the time and I said, can I work for you while I'm finishing my school? Because I really don't have much going on right now. And it so happened that she needed help in the tasting room. So I started working at Courson again, but in the tasting room. And we had a special event for our club members at the beginning of winter of 2019, and David Gates was there. So I saw Dave and I said, I remember I told him, Dave, you don't remember me, but I do remember you. You came to UC Davis one time and I tasted the wine and it was amazing. Like, do you hire interns by any chance? And he said, oh, let me give you my card. You should reach out to me after the event, because he was there with his friends and family, because he also likes Corrison wine. So I did email him the next day, and that's how I got my interview. But funny enough, because my visa didn't get approved, I stayed at Corrison. I ran into Dave and then ended up getting the Ridge internship that ultimately changed my career.
Wow, that's awesome. Uh, I'm glad you shared that. That's really awesome. I think a lot of people will appreciate that story.
The lesson learned is that go for it if you really want it. I did not have any connections in Napa Valley. I knew little about people or who people were and how to reach them. But if you really want something, it never hurts to ask, and it doesn't make you look silly even if you approach a person and say like, hey, you don't remember me, but I do remember you, and I really want to work for you because I really like the wine that you make. So
That's awesome. So do you remember what Ridge wine it was?
at the tasting, there were bottles from Lytton Springs. So I believe it was a Lytton Springs, and there was a Montebello.
Well, good. I'm going to ask you a little bit about the Montebello, if you don't mind. So tell me about that. Where do the grapes come from that make obviously that fabulous wine, the Montebello? And what is it? What are the vineyards like? What's the soil like? What is the area like where those are grown?
So for clarification, I worked in a Healdsburg facility where most of the Zinfandel is grown, and Mourvedre and Mataro. Sorry, at Ridge we used to call it Mataro, and Grenache and Syrah. So those vines are located right outside of the winery or in a very close proximity. And then Ridge had a second facility, or first, second, doesn't matter. The other facility, which is located in Santa Cruz Mountains, and that's Ridge MonteBello. And that's where the Cabernet grapes were grown and are grown for the Montebello wine. Also some Chardonnay, some Merlot, and Cab Franc. I did go to Montebello actually because we finished harvest at Lytton Springs a week or two earlier than Montebello. So actually myself and the other person who was the second intern at the time with me, who became a really good friend, we went to Montebello for a week and we helped picking the grapes because it was all hand picking during the day since it's a mountain site and mountain terrain. They did not pick at night like we did in Geyserville. It was too dangerous for people and that's something that's very common for vineyards on the mountain side. So we did spend the full week as two professional pickers for Ridge MonteBello in 2018. It was a lot of fun. It was a very nice environment because we were working alongside with people who are full-time employees. So it was very nice environment. The volume of the grapes that we were picking was quite large. It was still a small group of people that was making it happen. It's a beautiful site. To be completely honest, I can't think of the elevation right now, but it is more than 1,500 feet, and it overlooks San Jose and Cupertino. It's beautiful out there. You're definitely above the fog line. It takes a while to get to the top of the hill. Very different from most of the places in Napa Valley. It gets quite warm there during the day, but it also cools down at night.
Well, I don't think people realize how hard it is picking grapes. I mean, it is really hard, isn't it? I mean, tell us how hard it is.
It is very hard. To be honest, I never even attempted to do it while I was working in Geyserville because the professional picking crews, they were going at such speed that it was just unbelievable. If I tried, and when I tried to help them, I was actually slowing people down. So picking during the day at the different speed was definitely better for me. It is hard because, well, it takes a while and it's a repetitive motion that you do with your hand. And then once you fill your bucket or a basket or whatever you're using or a bin, you have to go and dump it into a macro bin that's in the middle of the row. So you constantly have to carry heavier things. You have to lift those up and throw them inside of a macro bin. Of course, people who do it, maybe physically it's not as challenging as it was for me, for example, because I don't do it quite often. But still, it's a very hard work, and don't forget that it's usually 95 degrees outside. Probably usually people don't work when it's hotter above 95, but it's like 90 degrees outside, so it's very hot. You need to make sure you stop for water breaks. You need to make sure you stop for shade breaks and stay hydrated. So there's a lot that goes into it. It's not just picking, it's also remembering that you need to drink water, that you need to eat well, that you need to take breaks.
So the site that it's on, you said it's up on a mountainside. So is it pretty steep?
It's very, very steep. Montebello is probably one of the steepest vineyards I've been to throughout the whole vineyard, actually. That's what's interesting because I did ended up working on mountain vineyards, and currently at Chandon, we do have a vineyard on Mount Veeder. It's quite steep, but it's not. There are some blocks that are very steep. There are some other blocks that are less steep. On Montebello, from what I remember, everything was very steep.
So as far as the Montebello is concerned, what goes into making that? It's a blend of a few different red grapes, right? Obviously, the majority is Cabernet, but what is the rest? Do you know?
I think it changed from year to year, and it always changes. So it's a barrel by barrel kind of tasting and figuring out what makes the best quality. Similar, to other wineries where they just choose the best of the best.
I was introduced to Montebello and I didn't know a whole lot about it. And I was thinking, all right, I'm going to go online and I'm going to buy some Montebello and I'm just going to have it shipped to my house. And that's how it was going to go. Little did I realize that it's so popular that you have to get on a waiting list in order to even be able to get any of it, right? And so I felt kind of silly then, back then when I did that. And I still haven't got any wine, but how long's that waiting list? Do you have any idea how long it takes somebody to get some of that wine?
I'm not sure. I know it was a lot. It was quite long, and they do, if I'll give you a tip. If you try to go to a tasting room, you might be able to get a bottle or two because there are sometimes limits on the number of bottles you could get just because of the limited production of that wine. But I did purchase a few bottles as I was interning at Ridge, so I'm still holding on to those. So I'm in a good spot right now, but I still I haven't gotten the 2019 Montebello. That's the vintage I worked for Ridge. So I do have Ridge bottles from 2019 from Lytton Springs and Geyserville, but not from Montebello.
Well, that'll be really special when you finally get that will be really special. I mean, not to mention that you worked on it, but it's just such a great historically great wine just to have that and know that you contributed to that. It's got to be pretty awesome.
Yeah, even a little contribution, of course, for me, it makes it very special.
Absolutely. All right, so let's go on to what you're doing now. So you're working at Chandon, and Chandon, for most people know who they are. They make sparkling wine for the most part. They also do still wines, but they're known more for their sparkling wines. So what's it like working at Chandon? And the reason I ask is because viticulture is got to be a little bit different. The practices have to be a little bit different for sparkling wine than they are for still wine. So how does that change your day-to-day duties knowing that these grapes are going to be made into sparkling wine?
That's a great question, actually. So that's true. The growing grapes for sparkling wine is very different from growing grapes for still wine, but ultimately not so different because we all want to have the best grapes possible to make the best wine possible. But the sites for the vineyards, our biggest vineyard is located in Carneros, and it's split between the county of Napa and Sonoma. It's a quite large vineyard. We have currently 530 acres there, so it's a large vineyard. We grow Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier over there. So the classic three varieties that are used to make sparkling wine in Champagne. So one of the most important ones, and that's basically what we use. In terms of viticulture, it's interesting because when you make still wine as a viticulturist or as a winemaker, you're really looking for a lot of the flavors in the grapes themselves. You don't want them to taste too green. You want the optimal ripeness. You want the seeds to be hardened and all of those things. In sparkling wine, most of the aromas of sparkling wine actually result from the secondary fermentation in the bottle and from the time that it gets to age with the yeast inside after the secondary fermentation. So when you pick your grapes and the grapes that you're looking for, they don't have to be very aromatic. That's what surprises a lot of the people. It's one of the things I'm trying to make it also quite simple. I don't want to be super technical, but you don't want very flavorful grapes because eventually it's going to be overpowering after the secondary fermentation. And again, the beauty of sparkling wine is what happens during that secondary fermentation in the bottle. It's not the base wine. So the base wine has to be, as if you will, as neutral as possible. Still fruity, still pleasant. You definitely don't want any off aromas in it, but it doesn't have to be overripe or very strong, definitely. So that's one thing. We also care a lot about the acidity. So, of course, we pick at quite low Brix grapes for our wines, but we care about maintaining a high acidity because, again, for sparkling wine, it's one of the most important things. And in general, because we look for these characteristics, like I said, less aromatic berries. Sorry, I'm going to take a step back. What I was saying about less aromatic berries, that means that we're looking for bigger berries. So the clones that we grow typically have slightly larger berries, more juicy, which works perfectly for sparkling wine. We try not to have any sunburn because, again, the phenolics, they ultimately make wine slightly bitter, and that's not what we're looking for. We grow slightly more grapes than people who grow grapes for still wine. And we grow slightly bigger canopies, and we can carry a little more tonnage on our vines just because, again, for the purpose and to make the wines that we make. So that's very different. So irrigation is very different. We don't look to stress our vines as much as the still wine producers. Some people say it's much easier because you can just irrigate nonstop, but that's not exactly true. There still has to be a plan for that. But it's a little different.
So you mentioned bricks earlier. So for a sparkling wine, what bricks do you guys typically pick a grape? Does it actually matter on which variety it is, or are they all kind of the same?
No, it's all the same for all three varieties because, again, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay are the three varieties that we use to make our sparkling wines. So for all of them, it's from 18.5 to 20 bricks. It's a perfect ripening window for us. For example, for our still wines, we're looking, and our still wines tend to be on the lower side of alcohol, and we pick those at 24 bricks, for example, 23, 24, just as a reference point.
So just for people who don't know, and I have to admit, I'm not an expert on working with sparkling wine. I've never worked at a winery that actually made one. So just quickly, just go through the process. What is the process from you bring the grapes in, and then what happens to turn it into these great wines that you guys make at Chandon?
Well, I bring the grapes in and then I go for vacation, and then the winemakers start doing their magic.
Okay.
No, I'm joking. Well, to a certain extent, working at the sparkling wine winery is a very technical job, and that's what I like a lot. It involves a lot of the logistics because once the grapes are received at the winery, they need to go directly to press. The goal is to minimize skin contact because if you've ever had a bottle of sparkling wine, except if it's a rosé sparkling wine, it's clear. So even Blanc de Noirs are clear. And the best way to get a clear juice, is to minimize the skin contact of the berries. So once the grapes arrive to the winery, they go directly to press and they get pressed right away. So the skins get removed. And then since we pick at night and at the colder time of the day, we rarely need to cool down the juice after it's gotten pressed. It's already quite cold. And then it goes through a clarification process, except at Chandon, we use a flotation process. So it's a little bit opposite of typical clarification. It goes through that process, and after that, it goes through fermentation. And then once wine is fermented, later in the year, the winemakers taste it around this time, and we taste it as a team. Usually in January is when the wines get tasted and the blends get assembled. So that's when our winemakers do their magic and they put the blends together. And depends on what those blends are, they go into different wines that we're making, and they're put in a bottle together with some yeast and some sugar, and the bottles are going to go through secondary fermentation. So at Chandon, we make all of our wines by classic method, which means that the secondary fermentation does occur in the wine bottle. And then after that, depends again on the wine, on which label it is, which wine it is, it will go through aging in the bottle after the fermentation. That's a very quick description of the process.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more that goes into it than just that. But just a couple questions I have, just because I'm curious about it, is what are they fermented in? The initial fermentation, are they stainless steel tanks?
Yeah, most of it is stainless steel, and there is one of the wines that we make that's called By the Bay. Actually, it's a Blanc de Blanc, so it's 100% Chardonnay, and part of that wine is fermented in oak barrel, but only a little bit. I think it's about 15%, and the rest is fermented in stainless steel.
So at some point, it reaches a certain Brix during fermentation. And is the fermentation then arrested somehow to stop it so that you can get it in the bottle and then add the other stuff to have it finish? Or is that not the case? It's allowed to go fully dry in the tanks before it goes in the bottle.
Yes, it goes fully, that is correct. It goes fully, entirely through the fermentation, so it gets completely dry, if you want to call it that way. And after that is when you add the solution of yeast and a little sugar water, sugar solution, which serves as a nutrient for the yeast so that they can actually start fermentation. Because yeast are not very happy to be fermenting in the bottle of wine because guess what? It contains alcohol. So yeast are sensitive to alcohol. And so it's not always as simple. It's always the right amount of yeast, and the right amount of sugar for them to be able to ferment second time.
And the carbonation comes from the yeast. They're
Yeah.
eating that sugar, producing the carbon dioxide, which is captured inside the bottle, which is what you see when you pour it. You see the bottles moving. That's where it comes from.
Yes, and you said it better than I would have said. But yes, typically in the initial fermentation or a big tank fermentation, all the CO2 either gets captured and or well it gets released from the tank because it's the opposite. You don't want the high concentration of CO2 because it can also be dangerous for the people working around it. Whereas in the secondary fermentation that happens in the bottle, that's exactly what we're looking for. We're looking to capture those little bubbles of CO2 inside of the bottle so that we can all enjoy a glass of sparkling wine later on.
So I've heard somebody say that if the bubbles are big in the sparkling wine, that means it's made a different way and not this traditional method that you're talking about. Is that right? Is there anything to that, or is that not true?
People say that, and there is a carbonation method. I'm not sure how popular it is in the United States. You could probably find it. And those, the artificially bottles that get artificially infused with CO2. So it's a regular wine where you just push in CO2. And those tend to be slightly bigger, but I mean, you can tell by different things that the wine might have not been made by a traditional method. And I think there are a few components that go into it. Just big bubbles on itself, maybe not, but could be a good indicator, or at least an indicator for you to ask a question. But then again, what's big bubble? You need to be able to compare it with something. I don't want to say that it's always the case. It might be the case, but not necessarily.
All right. Well, I've heard that, so I won't even say that anymore. That doesn't sound like there's anything to that, so that's okay. So, one of the sparkling wines that you recommended was the Mount Veeder sparkling. I think, is it a Cab sparkling? What is the grape?
No, it's a Chardonnay. It's
Oh,
also a Blanc de
Chardonnay. Okay.
Blanc.
Okay. So tell me what's great about that one. I know that was one that you had recommended. So why do you like that one? Why is that one so special?
Because I think of because of Mount Veeder. It's one of my favorite appellation in Napa. Despite I really love Courson that comes from Sant'Elena, I really enjoy mountain fruit, and being on a mountain is always gives you this very special feeling, and the grapes can grow much more concentrated and much more resilient to a lot of the factors because they ultimately do struggle a little more than the vines in the valley floor. Mount Peter, again, it's a special place for me. And the block from which this wine comes from was actually planted in 1980. So it's one of the oldest, as far as I know, one of the oldest Chardonnay blocks in Napa Valley. So most of the fruit comes from that block. It's a very special block with old vines that produces really beautiful fruit. That's what makes it so special for me personally. Just seeing the vines that, are older than I am and they're still there and producing the fruit, and that's quite incredible. And again, beautiful fruit. It has a perfect balance of acidity and and sugar. And again, very unique place. I highly recommend that wine. Of course, some of the best wines, they're always limited. So we don't get a lot of wine from Mount Veeder, but we're planting more vineyards there. So we're hoping for them to live as long as this other block that we're currently working with. So we're putting a lot of thought into future development and looking to plant the same clone, the same rootstock as their older brother, because again, our hope is that for it to be in the ground for 30 plus years at least.
So I also saw on the website for Chandon is a sparkling Cabernet. So tell me about that. That sounds very interesting. And for those people who love Cabernet, I know it's not like that. It's totally different. But what is it like doing that wine?
It's a quite new wine for us. It's definitely different, but it seems to be quite popular among our guests. People have different experience, different opinion. It's nice from one side because it's slightly tannic, but then you get the fizzy sensation. So it can work well on a warmer day when you're trying to choose between if you're a white wine drinker or a red wine drinker, but it's too hot. That can work quite well. So it can be very refreshing. It's just slightly on the sweeter side. It's not a sweet wine at all, but it's a fun wine to try. Different, to be honest. If you want an honest opinion, I prefer Blanc de Noir. That's my favorite category of sparkling wines. I really like a white sparkling wine made out of red grapes, usually Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier. So for me, it's different because again, I prefer what I prefer. But if people are looking for something new to try and something festive, that can work very well. It could also be a perfect wine for a day like Thanksgiving, for example, when there is a lot going on and it's just something fun to try and share with your family.
I definitely want to try that just because it, like you said, it's interesting and it interests me. So, all right. So, I told you I'd keep you for about an hour, and it's been an hour. So I have one more question for you. Besides the great wines you make at Chandon and Corrison and Ridge, what are some other wines that you like that you've had?
I will limit this to California most likely because I do drink a lot of European wines, but those are always changing. From the California producers, one of the places I've recently actually been to was Tablas Creek, and that was my second time there. I really like everything they do. I really love their wines, and they just make so many things, and it's all Rhone varieties. So different from what we get in Napa Valley, and they really like that. A lot of white blends. In Napa Valley, from what I've tried recently and what I really enjoy the wines of Steve Mathiasen, and one of the winery where he makes wines is called the Ashes and Diamonds. It was kind of a fun experience. I went there recently, and again, might be mixed reviews from people, but I actually really like the wines there because they're quite food friendly and lower in alcohol, and that's what I typically prefer to drink. So if you're like me, that could be a fun place to be. And also, what I liked about it is the design. It was very modern and unusual for Napa Valley. So it was like, okay, it's a fun place to be. Those are probably the ones that I've recently been to and can think from the top of my head.
Well, I have to say, Margarita, this has been awesome. It's been great spending this hour with you. And you were the first viticulturist I've talked to, but and all the winemakers I've talked to, they say the grapes are the most important thing. That's what you do. So obviously you have a huge part in making all these great wines that you guys make at Chandon. I hope you had fun. I really appreciate it. I'll have to check in with you later and get some of those, maybe some Moldova wines you can recommend that I might be able to get my hands on. I'd love to try those.
Yes, definitely. Moldova makes some great wines. It's difficult to get here, but as soon as I hear of anyone having some, I will let you know.
Okay, awesome.
And thank you for having me here today. I enjoyed telling my story, and I hope that it can be an inspiration to someone who tends to be, maybe a little unconfident or less shy to reach for what it is they want to reach or who it is they want to reach. So hopefully it can serve as an inspiration for someone.
I guarantee you it's going to be inspirational to somebody. I guarantee you that.
Thank you very much, Wesley.
Wow, that was so much fun. I'm always looking for things that inspire me, and I find Margarita's story so inspirational. I hope you get that out of it too. She definitely has a bright future in the wine business. I will leave a link in the show notes for Chandon's website so you can try some of their fabulous sparkling wines for yourself. I'm intrigued by the sparkling Cabernet and can't wait to try it for myself. I'll also leave my tasting notes from this 2018 Corrison Napa Valley Cabernet that was so instrumental in solidifying Margarita's passion for working in wine. Finally, I encourage you to visit the show website at www.obsessedwithwine.net to listen to past episodes, read tasting notes from wines recommended by the guests, and to sign up for the mailing list so you can take advantage of bonus episodes I'll be releasing in the future. You can also join the Obsessed with Wine podcast discussion group on Facebook to interact with me and other fans of the show. Thank you, and I'll see you next week. Cheers!